A school janitor's quiet dedication caught Barron Trump's eye, and what he did in response changed everything. The sun had barely begun to rise when Ronald James parked his old battered sedan in the far corner of the Oxbridge Academy parking lot. He always chose the same spot a little out of the way, as if to avoid drawing attention to the vehicle's peeling paint and dented bumper. The engine gave one final cough before dying, and Ronald sighed, gripping the steering wheel. For a moment, another day. Another chance to make ends meet. He grabbed his thermos from the passenger seat, gave the dashboard a gentle pat as if to thank the car for holding on another day, and stepped out. The early morning air was cool and the world was still quiet except for the faint chirp of birds and the distant rumble of a delivery truck. Oxbridge Academy was coming to life slowly, and Ronald liked it that way. It gave him a moment of peace before the chaos of the day began, pushing his trusty cleaning cart down the empty corridors. He felt a sense of pride. The floors gleamed under the overhead lights, the result of his meticulous care. He knew most people didn't notice, but that didn't matter to him. For Ronald, it wasn't about recognition, it was about doing the job right. Every classroom, every hallway, every trash can he approached them all with the same quiet dedication to the students. Ronald was simply Mr. James, the janitor, who always seemed to have a kind word or a warm smile ready. He knew their names, their favorite sports, even their quirks. Good morning, Marcus. How's that science project coming along? Hey, Jenny, I saw that goal you scored yesterday. Impressive. These small exchanges were a part of his daily rhythm, a way to connect in a role that often felt invisible. And yet his kindness never faltered, even when his body ached from hours of scrubbing and mopping. But outside these walls, life wasn't as polished. Ronald had faced more struggles than most could imagine. He had grown up in a small Florida town where opportunities were few and far between. Losing his wife to cancer 10 years ago had been the hardest blow of all. Suddenly he was both mother and father to their two children, juggling the roles of provider, caretaker, and disciplinarian. He worked long hours to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads, sacrificing his own comfort to give his kids a shot at a better future. The old sedan was a daily reminder of those sacrifices. Its engine sputtered more often than it purred, and every commute was a gamble. Some mornings it refused to start altogether, forcing Ronald to rely on a patchwork of borrowed rides or long walks, but he never let it dampen his spirit. One day at a time, he'd tell himself as he tightened his grip on the steering wheel and coaxed the car into motion. Despite his own hardships, Ronald never lost sight of what mattered. His children were his world, and everything he did was for them. He dreamed of seeing them succeed in ways he never could, and that dream kept him going even on the hardest days. Unbeknownst to him, Ronald's quiet resilience and unwavering kindness hadn't gone unnoticed. One student in particular, Barron Trump, had been paying close attention to most. Barron was just another student at Oxbridge, reserved, a little shy, but always polite. Yet behind his quiet demeanor was a sharp eye and an even sharper sense of empathy. Barron saw things that others missed, and lately he had been watching Mr. James. It started with little observations. The way Ronald always greeted everyone with a smile, even when he looked tired. The careful way he went about his work, ensuring every detail was perfect, and the moments when he thought no one was watching, like the time Barron saw him replace a broken locker handle before the student even reported it. There was something about Mr. James that stuck with Barron, something that made him want to know more. But Ronald had no idea that his simple acts of kindness were about to spark something extraordinary, a moment that would change his life forever. Barron Trump had always been different from the other students at Oxbridge Academy. While his peers chatted about the latest trends, compared luxury vacations, or argued over whose family had the better car, Barron often found himself on the fringes, observing. He wasn't uninterested, just thoughtful, raised with the idea that everyone's story mattered. He learned early on to pay attention to people, not just their words but their actions, their struggles, and the little things that often went unnoticed. It was during one of those moments of quiet observation that Barron first started to really notice Mr. James. To most of the students, the janitor was a background figure, someone who faded into the fabric of the school. But to Barron, Ronald James stood out. He saw the way Mr. James always arrived early, coffee thermos in hand, his cleaning cart rattling softly as he navigated the hallways. He noticed the care with which Ronald did his job, wiping down desks, polishing floors, ensuring the school felt more like a second home than just a building. At first, Barron didn't think much of it. It was just Mr. James doing his job right. But one day, as Barron waited outside for his ride after school, he saw something that stuck with him. Across the parking lot, Mr. James was hunched over the hood of his car, tools spread out on the ground. His old sedan had stalled again, smoke rising faintly from the engine. Ronald's sleeves rolled up and hands smeared with grease worked tirelessly even as the Florida sun beat down on him. When the car finally sputtered to life, Barron watched as Ronald wiped his forehead with a rag, muttered something under his breath, and climbed into the driver's seat. The sight stayed with him. The more Barron noticed, the more questions he had. Why was Mr. James driving a car that barely ran? How did he manage to show up every day with the same warm smile and kind words despite what looked like endless struggles? One afternoon, Barron worked Up the courage to approach him, he caught Ronald by the lockers fixing a broken hinge that no one else seemed to notice. "Hey, Mr. James," Barron said hesitantly. "Need a hand?" Ronald glanced up, surprised. "Well, hello there, young man," he said with a grin. "I think I've got it, but I appreciate the offer." Barron lingered, watching as Ronald finished the repair. "You're always fixing things," Barron said after a pause. "Do you ever get tired of it?" Ronald laughed, a deep, genuine sound that seemed to carry the weight of his years. "Oh sure, but someone's got to do it right. Besides, there's something satisfying about making things work again." That conversation was the first of many. Over time, Barron began to learn more about Mr. James. He learned about his two kids, how his son dreamed of becoming a mechanical engineer and his daughter wanted to be a teacher. He heard stories of Ronald's late wife, the love of his life, and how her loss had shaped him into the man he was today. Ronald never complained, but Barron could hear the undertone of exhaustion in his voice, the subtle hints of the sacrifices he made daily to provide for his family. One day Barron asked the question that had been on his mind since that moment in the parking lot. "Mr. James, why don't you get a new car? That one looks like it's ready to give up on you." Ronald chuckled, shaking his head. "A new car? Well, those things cost money, Barron, and money is not something I've got a lot of. Besides, as long as it gets me where I need to go, it's good enough for me." But Barron couldn't shake the thought. The more he learned about Mr. James, the more he felt the weight of his story. Ronald James wasn't just a janitor, he was a father, a mentor, and an unsung hero of the school. He quietly poured his heart into everything he did, asking for nothing in return. It didn't sit right with Barron. He knew he couldn't solve all of Ronald's problems, but maybe, just maybe, he could do something to make his life a little easier. That night at dinner, Barron brought it up with his parents. "You know Mr. James, the janitor at school?" he asked, pushing his food around on his plate. His father nodded. "The one who's always smiling?" "Yeah, I've seen him." Barron set his fork down, his expression serious. "I think we should help him. His car barely runs, and he works so hard for everyone at school. He never asks for anything, but he deserves more." His mother tilted her head, studying him. "What are you thinking, Barron?" Barron hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I want to get him a car, something reliable, something he doesn't have to fix every weekend just to get to work." His parents exchanged a glance. "That's a big gesture, son," his father said carefully. "Do you have a plan?" "I'll figure it out," Barron replied, his voice resolute. "He's done so much for all of us, and I can't just sit by and do nothing." But as determined as Barron was, he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't pull this off alone. Once the idea of helping Mr. James took root, Barron couldn't let it go. Every time he saw the janitor mopping floors or fixing broken lockers, he felt a growing sense of urgency. But this wasn't a simple task. Buying a car wasn't something a teenager could do on a whim. He needed a plan, and more importantly, he needed help. Barron started by talking to his parents again. "I don't want this to just be from me," he explained one evening over dinner. "It should come from everyone at the school. Mr. James has touched so many lives here. I think it would mean more if we all pitched in." His father leaned back, nodding thoughtfully. "You're right. This isn't just about money. It's about showing him how much is appreciated. You'll need to get people involved, though: teachers, students, staff. Are you ready for that?" Barron hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "I'll do whatever it takes." The next day, Barron started putting his plan into motion. He approached a few trusted classmates first, sharing his idea in hushed tones. During lunch, "You know Mr. James, right, the janitor?" He began testing the waters. "Of course," one of his friends said. "His awesome." "Why?" Barron leaned in, his voice low. "I want to get him a new car. His is falling apart, and he works so hard for all of us. I think it's time we did something for him." The initial reactions were a mix of surprise and excitement. "That's huge," one friend said. "How are we supposed to pull that off?" "We'll figure it out," Barron replied. "I'm not asking for a lot from anyone, just whatever they can give. If we all chip in, even just a little, it'll add up." Word began to spread quietly. Barron approached teachers, coaches, and even the school counselor, explaining his plan. The response was overwhelmingly positive. "Mr. James is one of the hardest working people here," one teacher said, slipping Barron a $50 bill. "Count me in." But Barron knew that even with everyone's contributions, the cost of a new car was steep. That's when his parents stepped in. His father contacted a local car dealership, explaining the situation. The dealership manager, touched by the story, offered to sell a brand new red Jeep SUV at a significant discount. "We'll cover the rest," Barron's father said. "You just focus on making this special for him." With the car secured, the focus shifted to the reveal. Barron wanted it to be a moment Mr. James would never forget. After some brainstorming with his friends and teachers, they decided to make the upcoming Friday assembly the stage for the big surprise. It was perfect. Everyone would be there, and they could present the gift in front of the entire school. The preparations kicked into high gear. Students created a giant banner that read, "Thank you, Mr. James." They painted it in the school's colors and decorated it with messages of gratitude. Teachers worked behind the scenes to coordinate the logistics, ensuring Ronald would be at the assembly without suspecting anything. Barron rehearsed his speech late into the night, pacing his room as he practiced the words that he hoped would convey just how much Mr. James meant to everyone. As the days ticked by, the excitement in the school grew. Students whispered about the plan in hallways, careful not to let Mr. James overhear. Even the staff joined in contributing to the fund and sharing stories about how Ronald had made their Days brighter, he once stayed late to help me find a student's lost backpack. One teacher recalled he didn't have to, but he did it anyway. By Thursday afternoon, everything was ready. The car sat hidden behind the gym, freshly washed and gleaming in the sunlight. The banner was hung, the speeches were finalized, and every detail had been meticulously planned. But as the big day approached, Barron couldn't shake the nervous energy building inside him. What if it doesn't go the way I'm imagining? He asked his mother that evening, his voice tinged with doubt. She smiled, placing a hand on his shoulder. Barron, this isn't just about the car, it's about showing him how much he's valued, and that's something no one can misunderstand. Friday morning arrived, and the energy at Oxbridge Academy was electric. Students filed into the auditorium, buzzing with anticipation. Barron stood backstage, clutching his note cards, taking deep breaths to steady himself. He glanced out at the crowd and saw Mr. James quietly taking a seat near the back, looking as unassuming as ever. The sight filled Barron with a sense of purpose. This wasn't just about a car, it was about honoring a man who had given so much to everyone without ever asking for anything in return. But as the curtains rose and the room fell silent, Barron wondered, would Mr. James truly understand how much he meant to all of them? Friday morning felt like any other day to Ronald James. The air was crisp as he parked his old sedan in its usual spot at the far end of the Oxbridge Academy parking lot. The engine wheezed and groaned before finally giving in with a sputtering halt. Ronald sat for a moment, taking a deep breath, mentally preparing for the long day ahead. His morning routine was predictable: mop buckets, floors to polish and classrooms to tidy. He loved the rhythm of it, though hard work never bothered him. It was his way of keeping things in order even when life outside the school walls felt chaotic. But today was different, even if Ronald didn't know it yet. Around mid-morning, as Ronald wheeled his cleaning cart down the hallway, the voice of the headmaster came over the intercom. Good morning, students and staff. Please report to the auditorium for a special assembly. We look forward to seeing you all there. Ronald barely registered the announcement. Assemblies were common at Oxbridge Academy, and they didn't usually involve him. He figured he'd stick to his routine, maybe get ahead on some maintenance work while the building was quiet. But then one of the teachers approached him with a smile. You should come too, Mr. James, you're going to want to see this. Reluctantly, he followed the flow of students and staff toward the auditorium. He slipped into the back row, hoping to blend into the crowd. The large room buzzed with excitement, though Ronald couldn't quite put his finger on why. He watched as the headmaster took the stage, greeted by enthusiastic applause. The headmaster spoke briefly, welcoming everyone, and explaining that today's assembly wasn't about academics or announcements, it was about celebrating a member of their community. That piqued Ronald's interest, but he was still clueless as to what was coming. Then Barron Trump walked onto the stage, holding a stack of note cards. Ronald knew Barron. He was the quiet, observant type who always greeted him politely in the hallways. Ronald smiled faintly, assuming the boy must have done something impressive to be given the stage. Good morning, everyone, Barron began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. I'm here today because there's someone at this school who deserves recognition, someone who makes this place better every single day. Ronald shifted in his seat, his brows furrowing slightly. He looked around, wondering who Barron could be talking about. I'm talking about Mr. James, Barron continued, and the room erupted in applause. Ronald froze, completely caught off guard. His hands gripped the edges of his chair as he stared at the young man on stage. Barron smiled at the crowd, waiting for the noise to die down before continuing. Mr. James isn't just our janitor, he's the guy who shows up every morning to make sure our classrooms are spotless, our hallways are clean, and our school feels like home. He's the guy who fixes what's broken, whether it's a locker, a leaky faucet, or even our spirits when we're having a bad day. The words hit Ronald like a wave. He'd always done his work without expecting thanks, and hearing someone acknowledge it so openly felt overwhelming. The lights dimmed slightly as a video began to play on the large screen behind Barron. It was a montage of clips and photos showing Ronald at work, mopping floors, repairing broken chairs, carrying supplies. Interspersed were interviews with students and staff sharing how much Ronald meant to them. He always has a smile for you, one student said. He never complains even when we make his job harder, another admitted sheepishly. Laughter rippled through the audience at that, but Ronald couldn't laugh. He was too stunned, his throat tightening as he tried to process what was happening. By the time the video ended, the entire auditorium was on its feet, clapping and cheering. Barron stepped forward again, his voice unwavering. Mr. James, we know you never ask for anything, but we see you. We see how hard you work, how much you care, and how you give so much of yourself to this school today. We want to give something back to you. Barron gestured toward the side of the stage where the double doors opened to reveal a gleaming red Jeep SUV parked under a large banner that read, "Thank you, Mr. James." The entire room erupted in cheers and applause. Ronald's jaw dropped as he stared at the car, his mind struggling to catch up with what his eyes were seeing. Mr. James, Barron said, turning toward him with a smile, "This is for you from all of us." The spotlight shifted to Ronald, who still hadn't moved from his seat. A teacher gently touched his shoulder, urging him to stand. Slowly he rose to his feet, his legs trembling as he made his way to the stage. The applause seemed deafening, but all Ronald could focus on was the car and the faces of the students and staff who had come together to make this moment happen. When he finally reached the stage, Barron extended the keys to him. Ronald hesitated for a moment before taking them, his hands shaking. He looked at Barron, then at the crowd, and finally back at the car. I don't know what to say, he stammered, his voice barely audible over the applause. He wiped at his eyes, which had filled with tears. You didn't have to do this. I just do my job. But as the cheers grew louder, Ronald began to realize that this wasn't just about the car, it was about all the lives he had quietly touched and the community that had come together to remind him that his kindness hadn't gone unnoticed. For what felt like an eternity, Ronald James stood frozen on stage, staring at the gleaming red Jeep SUV parked just a few feet away. The keys sat heavy in his hand, and the sheer enormity of the moment pressed down on him. The room was still buzzing with cheers and applause, but for Ronald everything seemed to blur. He was overwhelmed not just by the gift but by what it represented. He stepped forward slowly, his legs unsteady, and ran a trembling hand along the smooth, polished surface of the car. The bright red paint gleamed under the stage lights, a stark contrast to the battered sedan he had left in the parking lot that morning. His throat tightened, and when he finally turned back to face the crowd, his eyes were brimming with tears. The auditorium grew quiet, everyone waiting to hear what he would say. Ronald gripped the microphone tightly, struggling to find the words that could capture what he felt in that moment. I don't know what to say, he began, his voice thick with emotion. This is more than I could have ever imagined. I don't even know how to thank you. He paused, taking a deep breath as he glanced out at the sea of faces, students, teachers, staff, all looking back at him with warmth and admiration. I've always believed, he continued, his voice steadier now, that kindness isn't something you do for recognition, it's something you do because it's the right thing. I've tried to live my life that way, and to see all of you come together like this, it means more than I can ever put into words. The audience erupted into applause again, but Ronald raised a hand, signaling that he wasn't done. You know, when my wife passed away 10 years ago, I didn't think I'd ever feel this kind of joy again. She was my rock, my partner, and losing her left a hole in my heart that I didn't think anything could fill. But I had 2 kids to raise, and I knew I had to keep going for them. His voice broke slightly as he continued. Every morning when I get up, I think about them. They're the reason I do what I do, why I work so hard. I want them to see that no matter what life throws at you, you keep pushing forward, you keep giving even when you don't have much to give. He paused again, glancing down at the keys in his hand. And now, because of all of you, because of this incredible gift, I can give them a little more. I can get to work without worrying if my car will break down. I can take my daughter to her dance recital without wondering if we'll make it there. This isn't just a car, it's a blessing, one that will change our lives in ways you can't imagine. Tears streamed down his face now, and several in the audience were wiping their eyes too. Ronald looked at Barron, his voice soft but filled with gratitude. Barron, I don't know how you thought of this, but you've done something extraordinary. You saw me, you saw the work I do, and you cared enough to make this happen. That means more than I can ever say. He pulled Barron into a hug, holding him tightly as the crowd erupted into applause once again. When they broke apart, Ronald turned back to the microphone. To everyone who made this possible, students, teachers, parents, I want you to know that you've reminded me of something I almost forgot, that no matter how tough life gets, there's always good in the world. There are always people who care. The headmaster stepped forward, placing a hand on Ronald's shoulder. Mr. James, this school is lucky to have you. You're not just a part of this community, you're the heart of it, and today we're all here to celebrate you. The applause that followed was deafening. Students stood on their chairs, cheering and clapping, while teachers wiped away tears. Ronald looked out at the crowd, his heart swelling with a gratitude so profound it felt almost unreal. For years he had worked quietly, believing his efforts went unnoticed, but today, standing on that stage, he realized just how much his presence had mattered. As the assembly began to wind down, students approached the stage to shake Ronald's hand, hug him, or simply thank him. His children, who had been invited as part of the surprise, joined him on stage, their faces glowing with pride. Dad, you deserve this, his son said, throwing an arm around him. Later, as the crowd began to disperse, Ronald took a moment to sit behind the wheel of the Jeep. He ran his hands over the steering wheel, marveling at how it felt to sit in a car that didn't rattle, didn't groan, didn't feel like it might fall apart at any moment. His daughter climbed into the passenger seat, laughing as she explored the new car's features. This is amazing, Dad, she said. It's like a dream. Ronald smiled, the weight of years of struggle beginning to lift it as he said quietly, and it's all because of them. But as Ronald drove out of the parking lot later that day, he realized that the car was just the beginning. The real gift was the reminder that his work, his kindness, and his sacrifices had not been in vain. As the assembly ended, the students poured out of the auditorium, but a steady stream of them lingered, each waiting for a moment to speak to Mr. James. Some shook his hand, others gave him quick hugs, and a few simply said thank you, Mr. James, before hurrying off, their cheeks flushed with emotion. Ronald stood near the stage, overwhelmed but smiling as his children clung to his sides, their own eyes sparkling with pride. One student, a shy sophomore, approached hesitantly, clutching a piece of notebook paper. Mr. James, she said softly, I just wanted to give you This she handed him the folded note and disappeared into the crowd before he could say anything. Opening it, he found a heartfelt message. Thank you for always being so kind. There were days I felt invisible, but your smile reminded me that someone saw me. I hope today showed you how much you mean to all of us. Ronald read the note twice, his throat tightening. It wasn't just the care or the applause, it was the quiet acknowledgement of the little things he thought no one noticed that made him feel seen for the first time in a long time. Later that afternoon, as Ronald prepared to leave, the red Jeep SUV waited for him in the staff parking lot, a stark contrast to the tired sedan it replaced. His children climbed into the back seat laughing as they explored every new feature. It even smells new, his daughter exclaimed, running her hands along the upholstery. Ronald paused before getting in, turning to look back at the school. The day's events replayed in his mind. The cheers, the speeches, Barron's steady voice as he spoke about the impact one person could have. Ronald had spent years cleaning these hallways, quietly going about his work, never expecting recognition, but today had shown him that every act of kindness, no matter how small, leaves a mark. Driving home, the car hummed smoothly beneath him, a far cry from the sputtering groans he was used to. His son leaned forward from the back seat, a broad grin on his face. You know, Dad, this car is awesome, but what's even cooler is that everyone loves you so much. I mean, they really love you. Ronald glanced at him in the rearview mirror, his heart swelling. It's not about being loved, son, it's about doing what's right even when no one's watching, and sometimes when you least expect it, people show you that they were watching all along. That evening, after the excitement of the day had settled, Ronald sat at the kitchen table staring out the window. The red Jeep was parked in the driveway, gleaming even in the dim light of the setting sun. His children were in the living room chatting animatedly about their plans for the weekend. For the first time in years, Ronald felt a profound sense of peace. He thought of the note from the student tucked safely in his pocket and the way Barron had described him during the assembly. It wasn't just about the car, it was about what it symbolized. Ronald realized that all the little things he'd done, the kindness he'd offered without expecting anything in return, had created a ripple effect. The students, the teachers, even the parents, they had noticed, and today they had given back in a way that left him humbled and deeply moved. In the days that followed, the story of the assembly spread beyond the walls of Oxbridge Academy. Students shared clips of the moment on social media, and before long the story gained traction online. People from all over began commenting on the posts, sharing their own stories of unsung heroes who had impacted their lives. Ronald was stunned by the attention, but grateful for the chance to inspire others. If his story encouraged even one person to show kindness or gratitude, it was worth it. Reflecting on the day, Ronald knew the most valuable lesson wasn't the one he'd learned, it was the one the students had demonstrated. Gratitude has the power to transform. It connects people, lifting them in ways that go far beyond material gestures. A simple acknowledgement of someone's hard work and dedication can light a spark that carries far beyond the moment. For Ronald, the red Jeep would always be a reminder of the community that had embraced him, not just for what he did but for who he was. And for the students, the day served as a lesson in the impact of coming together to celebrate the people who make their world better, one small act at a time. As the sun set on that unforgettable day, Ronald sat on the porch with his children, watching them laugh and joke as they talked about the future. He smiled, knowing that the best lessons aren't taught in classrooms, they're lived through moments like these. This isn't just about me, he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. It's about all of us. Kindness is contagious, and if we keep it going, who knows what it can do. So let's take a moment to reflect on this story and ask ourselves, who in our lives deserves a thank you, a kind word, or even just a smile? Because as Ronald's story shows us, even the smallest gestures can lead to extraordinary moments. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that remind us of the power of kindness and community. Together we can create a world where no good deed goes unnoticed, because kindness isn't just a gift, it's a legacy.